Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee, streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them, she thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for February 17th, 2022. This is your co-host, Chris Driscoll, and along with me is Rainer Shea, our other co-host. That's why we call it co-hosts. Anyway, getting right to it tonight. At the top of the list is Psyops, cults, late-stage capitalist nihilism, and using chaos to sabotage revolution by Rainer Shea.
I believe that the forces of reactionary intrigue exploit late-stage capitalist nihilism to create controlled opposition. They use the sense of fatalism that's so prevalent within the public, within the imperial center. The sense that capitalism is here to stay, it's a fixture of civilization, and however absurd it is, however unjust it is, it can't ultimately be defeated. This fundamental false idea that capitalism can't be defeated and that communism is doomed to fail is always exploited to divert what could become revolutionary consciousness into these counter-revolutionary directions. And sometimes these instances of controlled opposition have gone in truly monstrous directions. Throughout the 60s counterculture movements, the 60s social movements, the CIA fostered psychedelic use through professors like Timothy Leary. He was used by the CIA to promote LSD among students. They fostered drug use so that they could divert radicalism from Marx and Lenin to LSD, speed, all of these drugs. And in at least one instance, the consequence was tragedy. Charles Manson, as detailed in the book Chaos, Charles Manson and the Secret History of the 60s, by I think his first name is Tom O'Neill. O'Neill's book, I've been listening to the audio of it, and it's fascinating stuff, where he looks at all of these bizarre events surrounding the Manson case, how Manson was consistently enabled by law enforcement up until his trial, within which the details were clearly distorted to protect the powerful people who were complicit in what had led up to the murders. And what can be deduced from this story is that the CIA used Manson as a lab rat for their experiments in MK Ultra mind control, which were centered around LSD. An infamous part of this is that Manson, despite being utterly uneducated, well, aside from some charisma classes that he had taken, personal charisma coaching he had taken, was able to brainwash a whole group of people into being willing to commit horrific murders within the span of months. And it's clear that some MK Ultra stuff was involved in this. And it becomes more apparent the more I listen to this audio of that book, hearing all of these strange inconsistencies in the official Manson story, and how law enforcement enabled him, how they allowed him to keep returning to the desert, keep building his family, despite him being a parolee who repeatedly violated parole. And you know what this all sprung out of was a dark side of the New Age movement, where Manson's pitch to the hippies that he recruited and brainwashed was that he was offering them a New Age escape from the corrupt society. It was the same pitch that was used by the Finders, another cult from that era, which has infamously been exposed for having CIA ties, predictably. So as you look at these trends that I detail in my article, you notice these overarching themes of the government manufacturing social ills so that it can exploit them towards counter-revolutionary means. And another interesting part of this is Manson was definitely someone who could be used towards sabotaging liberation movements. He was an intensely paranoid racist. He believed he was under attack from the Black Panthers. And those are the types of people that the feds use to carry out their warfare, you could say, by proxy.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I was quite young when all that was happening, in my teens. And I didn't really realize how deep this stuff went. The CIA's capers especially in the 50s and 60s, are no less than astounding. You've got the remote viewing stuff that they were involved in. You've got the Congress for the Congress for cultural freedom that they were involved with, that sucked in every major writer in Europe and in the United States and Canada and so forth. You've got You've got this Manson kind of caper going on. You've got the Bay of Pigs invasion. I mean, these guys were just going wild. I mean, out of control. You know, this was the age of postmodernism. Postmodernism has similar kinds of qualities to what you're talking about, the nihilism, the insistence that even though capitalism is fucked, so is communism. You know, I mean, it's amazing what the CIA was able to do to manipulate the mass culture of the time in twisted ways that really, really damaged our society. And they went towards the youth, especially. With this Manson stuff, I was always amazed at the time how Manson was able to wheedle his way into the Hollywood elite, the rock and roll and folk rock elite. You know, I mean, the people like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. He was hanging out at Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young's home. He was in with the Beach Boys. I mean, he's, you know, a couple of the Beach Boys were you know, that close to being part of his cult. Just amazing stuff. And yeah, I haven't read the article yet. I will read it, and I urge everybody else to read it too. It's really a great look into what they were doing then to fuck us. My question now is, what are they doing now to fuck us? They're just as imaginative, just as out of control. And you know, what we'll undoubtedly find out 20 and 30 and 40 years from now, like we're doing with this, or 50 even years ago, we'll find out what's going on now and probably be just as sick-headed as this is. It's really good stuff. Next on the list, NATO expansion has suffered a major setback. Now, this article it's written by Glenn Deason. He's a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and an editor at the Russia in Global Affairs Journal. The article comes to us from RT, the RT network, the television network brought to us by the kindness of the Russian people. The Russian people pay for it, basically, because RT is worldwide, and the whole apparatus that helps RT is paid for by the Russian people. Anyway, they say, or he says, Glenn Deason says, NATO's policy of expansionism at the expense of Russia's security concerns has suffered a major setback. The bloc's members never intended to push Ukraine to abide by its commitments to the Minsk agreements, designed to put an end to fighting in the Donbass, as autonomy in eastern Ukraine would challenge its control in the pan-European space. Instead, NATO countries aim to undermine the Minsk agreement by changing the reality on the ground. Russia was intended to be weakened by sanctions, and Ukraine was to be strengthened by supplying weapons. The best moment for renegotiating the Minsk agreement occurred less than a year ago, as Ukrainian forces mobilized along the border of Donbass with the threat of retaking the region by force. NATO responded by pledging their support to the authorities in Kiev and threatened Moscow with devastating sanctions if it would come to the defense of the breakaway regions. Russia is dividing Europe, but not in the way you think. Russia is dividing. Russia mobilized its troops in response, established clear red lines that would trigger an intervention, and made it clear that further Western sanctions would merely intensify Russia's economic decoupling from Europe. So what has been the result of balancing NATO expansionism? Western states are finally discussing pan-European security, limitations or non-deployment of offensive weapons systems, and the most taboo topic of the past 30 years, recognizing that Russia has legitimate security interests. Think tanks are discussing if NATO expansionism has reached its limit and the possibility of a neutral status for Ukraine, similar to the model of Finland or Austria. The French president even suggested that we need a new approach to pan-European security, and observed what should have been obvious. Europe cannot have security if Russia is denied security. The US will also struggle to make Moscow's withdrawal fit into its narrative of Russian expansionism. Washington's most advertised Invasion Day reveals much advertised Invasion Day reveals the absurd narrative that Russia is pursuing territorial conquest or attempting to restore the Soviet Union. Even the Europeans appear to be exhausted by Washington's confrontational approach and war hysteria. Russia's achievements in the current standoff are limited but significant. A mutually acceptable post-Cold War settlement in Europe has not been achieved, but opening up discussions on pan-European security implies that we can fully address the foolish decision in the 1990s to construct a Europe without Russia. The current standoff has produced a split in the West. Some argue that NATO expansionism has reached its limits and a new format for pan-European security is required. Others suggest that there is more need for a forceful NATO to counter Russian aggression. Let's hope that the Cold Warriors will finally be forced into retirement.
The only way out for the Cold Warriors in this situation of rising multipolarity is a false flag. It's the only way that they can make reality fit their narrative. And this works with Vietnam, this works with Iraq, with all of these places. I mean, it was the way that U.S. global imperialism got its start with the supposed attack on a U.S. ship that started the Spanish-American War. So maybe that'll be how U.S. imperialism ends.
The Maine. Remember the Maine.
Yes.
That was the name of the ship, the Maine.
The Maine. I think that it's increasingly likely that they'll carry out a false flag against Russia, since there are these stories that have been coming out about Russia supposedly being about to fabricate atrocities on Ukraine's part there are all of these psychological operations that are being presented. And it seems like any day they'll cook up a provocation that we'll hear about and that most people will believe until it's too late.
Yeah. Well, maybe so. Maybe so. I mean, there have been these kind of false flag provocations vis-a-vis Russia in the past, like the airliner that was shot down over Ukraine that was obviously shot down by the Nazis who run Ukraine. And yet they're still, to this very day, claiming that Russia or the Russian-sponsored separatists in the Donbass shot the plane down. So yeah, I mean, they are quite capable of doing it. Whether people are going to believe it this time around, I'm not too sure, because Washington has done this so often, and everybody remembers the WMDs that were never there, so we'll see. Next on our list, imperialists apply Africa destabilization model to Latin America. Rainer Shea.
I look at places like Haiti, what's happened with Haiti in the last year, where first the imperialists propped up a dictator as he rose to power. Then, for whatever reason, maybe because the dictator was getting too big of an inconvenience due to his lack of popularity, they decided to have their Colombian proxies assassinate him last summer. And since then, Haiti has been in a political crisis. And it really parallels what the imperialists have been doing across Africa these last 10 years. They've been carrying out coups. They've been meddling in every way imaginable. They've been perpetually trying to use these manufactured crises as a pretext for invasion. And we're also seeing this in Latin America with instances like when last October, a right-wing militia group seized control over a coca market in La Paz in Bolivia to try to gain social and economic influence to start attacking the socialist government there. And they're perpetually inflaming the conflict along the Colombian-Venezuelan border by I think it was when they kept classifying the FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces in Colombia, as a terrorist organization. So Washington is perpetually inflaming these kinds of conflicts, proxy wars, in addition to these kinds of political crises throughout Latin America. We also see these kinds of hybrid warfare campaigns in Southeast Asia, places like Myanmar and Thailand, increasingly Cambodia. For the most part, this is Washington's punishment against the global South for increasingly embracing China. And I see it as a preemptive series of counter-revolutions where they're destabilizing the globe to stop the globe from embracing multipolarity.
Yeah, this MO, it's the CIA MO for sure. And we've seen it often in the past. Seen it quite a bit in Africa in the recent past, and undoubtedly we'll see it more in Latin America, or at least attempts to do it. Hopefully, the socialist democracies of Latin America will be super on their toes right now and super aware of imperial sabotage, and they will foil it. I have high confidence that Venezuela will foil it. I have high confidence that Nicaragua will foil it. Some of the other red tide or pink tide countries, my confidence is a little bit less. Not quite sure about Bolivia. We'll see. Bolivia's been burned already once, so presumably they're more on the ball this time than the last time. Next on the list, MMT, Marglin and Marx. And this article comes to us from Michael Roberts, my favorite Marxist economist, and from his blog, The Next Recession, it's called. The blog is called The Next Recession. Anyway, he says, let me start this post by quoting Noah Smith, liberal economist and Bloomberg journalist, from his post on Monday on modern monetary theory, MMT. The New York Times, this is from a quote from Noah Smith. The New York Times just came out with a big glowing write-up of MMT entitled Time for a Victory Lap. This article aroused anger of just about every macroeconomist on Twitter, and with good reason. It demonstrates very little understanding of the issues at play or the state of the policy debate, and it rhetorically elevates a fringe ideology to a position of importance and centrality that it neither occupies nor deserves. The NYT article on MMT, written by Gina Spilak, is mostly a puff piece about Stephanie Kelton, MMT's most well-known proponent. In glowing tones, it describes Kelton's clothes, her office, her house, her neighborhood, her blog, her manner of speaking, her personal story, and so on, calling her the star architect of a movement that is on something of a victory lap. Very little is written about the background of the macroeconomic policy debate, and what does appear is highly questionable. The NYT article is provoked. The NYT article also provoked orthodox Keynesian gurus like Larry Summers and Paul Krugman into more scathing comments on MMT. Summers tweeted, "I am sorry to see the New York Times taking MMT seriously as an intellectual movement. It is the equivalent of publicizing fad diets, quack cancer cures, or creationist theories." A fierce debate followed in the social media and encouraged new critical articles on the validity of MMT. However, in this particular post, I'm not going to repeat all the arguments from a Marxist perspective against the main propositions of MMT. You can read those in a number, or 6, I think, of posts on this blog. In this longer piece here, and in various video debates on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, But given the latest discussion, I can add two things which are a reminder of MMT's failures. First, as explanation of money flows in a capitalist economy, and second, whether government spending financed by the state issuance and the creation of money can deliver economic growth, full employment and rising incomes without touching the sides of capital's exploitation of labor. First, MMT argues that a state with a sovereign control over its economy, over its currency, e.g., US government and the dollar, can issue as much money as it likes. This is obviously true as the state controls the issuance of national currency. But what is not true is that spending of this money, dollars and euros, etc., automatically creates more value in things and services in an economy. As Keynesian Michael Pettis has argued before and repeats in a new article, what MMT really shows is that there are no direct spending constraints on a government that is monetarily sovereign. It can always create money or debt to fund its spending needs without first needing to obtain the funding. This doesn't mean, however, that there are no indirect constraints. In fact, there are always economic constraints. This is because an economy cannot consume and invest more than it produces and imports. I would put it another way. Money is not value. It is the representation of value. More money does not mean more value. If there is no more value created, then more money, dollars, just represents the same value. The money has depreciated in its purchasing power or in its value per unit of currency. And there is no guarantee that increased government spending, whether financed by issuing more currency, MMT, or more government bonds, orthodox Keynesianism, will lead to more value. That depends on decisions of capitalist companies to invest in more labor and or technology. And that in turn depends on whether more profit can be made. This is what Keynesian theory and MMT, really just an offshoot of Keynesian theory, do not recognize. By the way, you can read a recent repost on this in critique of MMT, and then he gives a URL link. If you're interested, you can see it in the link that we provide for this article below this video. And it's by Eduardo Garzon, who shows exactly where the difference is between Marxist monetary theory and MMT. Of course, I consider the former a better explanation of a capitalist monetary economy, and Garzon the latter. But the other fault line of MMT is what happens when the increased government spending financed by the printing of money does not lead to an increased value, but instead to inflation of prices. It is ironic that just as the New York Times claims that MMT has won the day in refuting the view of mainstream macro that balanced budgets and controls of public debt are required, i.e. austerity, along comes a huge hike in inflation rates. Mike King in his blog says, the rise in inflation was exacerbated by supply chain inefficiencies and disruptions, but it was almost certainly propelled to some extent by COVID relief spending and the Fed's extremely loose monetary policy. That was a reminder that aggregate demand has a limit, that you can only boost the economy with fiscal and monetary policy so much before costs start to appear. Those costs, as any orthodox macro theory will tell you, are due not to any issue with government's financing, but to the economy's real constraints, the limits of real resources available. MMT proponents have always recognized that if an economy reaches full employment and cannot grow anymore, then inflation could ensue. Their answer is that the government should then increase taxation to destroy the surfeit of money spending. But as I have argued before, in effect, MMT policy then becomes like just like orthodox Keynesian macro management, i.e., trying to tune the economy along the narrow path of growth without inflation with a judicious use of taxes and spending. Unfortunately, the anarchic capitalist accumulation process cannot be adjusted in this way, as the failure of Keynesian macro management in the last major bout of high inflation and low real GDP growth in the late 1970s showed.
Do you remember a group that was trending in Left Book a few years ago called Real Progressives? Mm-hmm. They're all about modern monetary theory.
Huh.
That's apparently their claim to being real progressives. And hearing that explained, I realized that still is a cult that some of these are cultivating.
It is.
As if to compensate for their theoretical deficiency. They're literally using magical thinking.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Surprisingly, that Summers quote, Larry Summers, that I mentioned, was one of the best quotes along those lines. I mean, I don't agree with Larry Summers very much, but or not hardly at all. But in that case, that was a great quote. Anyway, the next on our list is the U.S.-Afghan failure portends to the fall of many states around the globe. Rainer Shea.
When the U.S. Lost in Afghanistan, and it lost at least in the sense that it failed to continue its project for destabilizing the country in total, so that the country could no longer pursue Chinese development. When the U.S. failed in Afghanistan, it meant more than the loss for its heroin rat line or its project to totally destabilize the country. It meant another blow to Washington's credibility as the supreme military power. It proved once again, after Vietnam, after its quagmire in Iraq, after its failures in all of these places throughout the last half century of imperial decline, that even greatly inferior forces can win against the U.S. military if they carry out the right tactics. And I'm looking at the events in India and Colombia in this last year of their history of counterinsurgency and their battles against their internal insurgencies. And I'm seeing these recurring trends where modern states, modern capitalist states in this era of intensifying class conflict are faced with the dilemma of whether to greatly hold back their counterinsurgency efforts and in an effort to not alienate the masses, or engage the guerrillas in total war, which would easily subdue the guerrillas, but would at the same time alienate the masses and potentially create an even bigger rebellion. And that's the eventuality that U.S. military strategists, as I explain in my my article, have been seriously considering in recent years. In these documents, they've been imagining scenarios where they'll have to make this very difficult choice between greatly limited counterinsurgency with the benefit of more likely retaining the hearts and minds of the people, or scorched earth counterinsurgency, which would easily wipe out the guerrillas but would alienate the people. And it's pretty simple when you really think about it, and that gives me hope that revolutionaries can triumph in the core of imperialism in the coming decades.
Yes. Well put. And this is inevitable. I mean, what we're seeing in Afghanistan, inevitable when a failing empire is grabbing at straws, basically. Okay. Next on the list, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal whip up war frenzy. And this article is by Alan McLeod. Alan's one of my favorites. He's really a good, solid journalist. He works for the Mint Press News. And his article, I think, really makes a very good point here. Mint Press study, New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, driving U.S. to war with Russia over Ukraine, by Alan McLeod. This Mint Press study reveals about that 90% of recent opinion articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal have taken a hawkish view on the Ukraine conflict, written by pundits tied to the national security state, promoting NATO as a defender of the free world, and describe Putin as Hitler incarnate. Amid tough talk from the European and American leaders, a new Mint Press study of our nation's most influential media outlets reveals that it is the press that is driving the charge towards war with Russia over Ukraine. 90% of recent opinion articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal have taken a hawkish view on the conflict, with anti-war voices few and far between. Opinion columns have overwhelmingly expressed support for sending U.S. weapons and troops to the region. Russia has universally been presented as the aggressor in this dispute, with media glossing over NATO's role in amping tensions, while barely mentioning the U.S. collaboration with neo-Nazi elements within the Ukrainian ruling coalition. Western media and governments have expressed alarm over a suspended buildup of Russian military forces close to its over a 1,200-mile border with Ukraine. There are reportedly almost 100,000 troops in that vicinity, causing President Joe Biden to warn that this is the most consequential thing that's happening in the world in terms of war and peace since World War II. Yet this is far from the first media panic over a supposedly imminent Russian invasion. In fact, warning of a hot war in Europe is near yearly occurrence at this point. In 2015, outlets such as Reuters and the New York Times claimed that Russia was massing troops and heavy firepower, including tanks, artillery, and rocket launchers right on the border, while normally sleepy frontier towns were abuzz with activity. In 2016, there was an even bigger meltdown with the media across the board predicting that war was around the corner. Indeed, The Guardian reported that Russia would soon have 330,000 soldiers on the border, yet nothing came to pass and the story was quietly dropped. With the next spring came renewed warnings of conflict. The Wall Street Journal claimed that tens of thousands of soldiers were being deployed to the border. The New York Times upped that figure to as many as 100,000. A few months later, U.S. News said that thousands of tanks were joining them. In late 2018, the New York Times and other media outlets were again up in arms over fresh Russian buildup, this time 80,000 military units. And in the spring of last year, it was widely reported that, for instance, by Reuters and the New York Times, that Russia had amassed armies totaling well over 100,000 units on Ukraine's border, signaling that war was imminent. Therefore, there are actually considerably fewer Russian units in Ukraine's border than there were 11 months ago, according to Western numbers. Furthermore, they are matched by a force of about 250,000 Ukrainian troops on the other side.
Again, I see a false flag as the only way to really bring these operations to fruition. And, you know, my concern is when we hope, when we are hopeful that most people won't accept whatever narrative they cook up about Russia, the big war narrative, then we're really just assuming most people aren't as most people are basically as educated as us. And you know, it took me a while to come to the consciousness that I'm at now about geopolitics. It's took a kind of specific pipeline of anti-imperialism for me to become the type of person who easily parses out what's true and what's not on the news. And I think that what we can see as most hopeful is the way that our conditions are radicalizing the masses towards revolutionary consciousness. There are these growing strikes, there are these growing massive protests, record protests in these last couple of years. And we can't idealize the masses. They're not as educated as the people who've spent the most time studying this stuff, but the masses are definitely coming around towards class struggle, and that's hopeful.
Well put. Well put. Okay, back to the agenda here. Where are we? Settler colonialism is an inevitable incubator for fascism.
We're seeing this right now with instances like an image that is being spread around social media right now of these white supremacists. And I think the city is in the US. It's either the US or Canada, probably the US. But they have this disgusting sign that they've been hanging over the highway that says, white patience has limits. And this is part of a larger trend we've been seeing with groups like the Patriot Front and their marches on Washington, their promotions of Nazi rhetoric in the aftermath of January 6th. It's clear that the fascist movement in this country is preparing for a second coup to try to install Trump in 2024. And it's inevitable that this would happen because settler colonialism is inextricably tied to fascism. I mean, it's inseparable in that settler colonialism's essential rationale for existing is the idea that entire populations, entire nations need to be rolled over, and that's justifiable. And when you have a society that is completely oriented around denying reality, denying history, of course you're going to get the kinds of explosions in racism that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, we are seeing this, especially among the middle class. Now, the middle class you look at all of these fascist, nationalist, and reactionary movements today, and the middle class comprises a large part of their foot soldiers. And you definitely see that in cases like January 6th of last year, the January 6th rebellion, or whatever you want to call it. I call it a clown car. The middle class is definitely, just as we've seen in other fascist movements, the middle class is definitely the part of our population that makes up the largest percent. Now, there are working class people as well, a small minority of working class people who get involved in these movements as well. They're definitely a minority among the working class, but the middle class is definitely where we're going to have to keep our eyes on. It's not every middle class person that is some kind of a fascist or reactionary, but the fascist and reactionary movements draw most of their supporters from the middle class. So that's the class we're going to have to keep an eye on. China and Cuba's markets reforms aren't revisionist.
This comes from an argument Marx made in Critique of the Gotha Program, where he described the process towards full communism, where we've developed beyond classes and states, as not an instantaneous one, but as an incremental one. He was describing a kind of socialist society that has not yet thrown off the things that it's inherited from capitalist society. And isn't this the very basis for Marxism, that socialism hasn't been able to develop without capitalism to develop society beyond feudalism? And that's the rationale that countries like China and Cuba have rightly used, that they need to utilize markets in order to develop themselves towards the point where full communism is feasible. And that's especially true in these last couple of years, where countries like Cuba have been getting crushed by the pandemic-related economic crisis. Cuba has been getting crushed by sanctions, so it's had to open up its economy to a certain extent. But is this revisionist? No, it's in line with what Marx described.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. Let's see. Next on the list, Los Angeles activists join National Day of Action to say no to war with Russia. And this article comes to us from Liberation News, which is the newspaper of the Party of Socialism and Liberation. Los Angeles activists join National Day of Action to say no to war with Russia. On February 5th, members of several progressive organizations based in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles area, joined with over 50 cities in a nationwide day of action. Demonstrators and speakers were united around a singular message: no war on Russia. The demonstration took place outside the Wilshire Federal Building in Los Angeles, which sits across the street from the Los Angeles National Cemetery. The bodies of thousands of veterans of America's imperialist wars are buried there, with undoubtedly more joining their ranks if the U.S. march to war against Russia continues. Those at the rally were able to come and enjoy solidarity with other activists calling for peace. Liberation News spoke with Inya Martinez, an organizer with the U.S. Hands Off Cuba Committee, who said that it was necessary to stand against a war because a full-scale war with a nuclear power is potentially suicidal. While the prospect of such a war is appalling to her, Martinez also said it was inspiring to be surrounded by other like-minded activists fighting for peace. Speakers at the demonstration highlighted the many struggles that are inextricably linked to the struggle against U.S. imperialism. Juan Jose Gutierrez of the Full Rights for Immigrants Coalition shared the history of NATO in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He described the pattern of Western imperial powers breaking promises to the Soviet Union by admitting former nations of the Warsaw Pact to NATO, a strategic alliance whose sole purpose is to militarily encircle and threaten the Soviet. He also stated the immigrant community of Los Angeles is united in calling for a de-escalation of tensions. Gutierrez also explained that just as workers living in the U.S. desire peace and financial security, so too do the people of Eastern Europe, who would undoubtedly suffer the consequences of the war that the U.S. is pushing for. Now, that's the, let's see. Oh, yeah, we've got one more after this. So let's see. Go ahead, Rainer.
NATO's cognitive warfare and the preemptive counterrevolution. There's an infamous NATO-sponsored report from 2020 that we've discussed many times, where it describes the goal of cognitive warfare as to make everyone into a weapon. And this really parallels the tactics that US imperialism has used in places like Yugoslavia, where the CIA has carried out all of these false flag attacks to blame scapegoats like the Serbs. They've fabricated or falsely pinned all of these atrocities upon the designated enemies, and they've persuaded much of the population to join in on the demonization of these enemies, whether these enemies are the Serbs, the Chinese, the communists, like in Indonesia. In Indonesia, the CIA's puppet regime after the 1965 coup fabricated these stories about satanic sexual bizarre murders of the generals, and they paraded this story for decades as justification for demonizing all communists in Indonesia and manufacturing consent for mass participation in the mass killings of political dissidents that followed the coup. So that's the most extreme end of what I'm talking about, where the CIA instigates potential violence through its promotions of these false atrocity stories. And now we're seeing this again in the form of the Xinjiang genocide propaganda, where China is getting blamed for these entirely fabricated atrocities. And we recently experienced a new wave of this propaganda campaign with the vilification of the Beijing Winter Olympics, where people...
Yeah, that's well put. And yes, we've certainly seen this quite a lot in recent times. NATO is using, and so are the CIA, the NSA, and so forth, using cognitive warfare and preemptive counter-revolution. Once again, they're grabbing at straws, of course. In the end, the working class will prevail. Well, that's it for tonight. Want to thank, first of all, Rainer Shea for yeoman's work in putting out these articles and in describing them to us. I want to thank all of the viewers and listeners out there who tuned in, and invite you to tune in again next week when we'll have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. And, you know, all of these articles that I have described or read you clips from or highlights from, I certainly don't cover the entire article, and there's lots more to it. So I urge everyone to take a look at these articles, especially in ones that you find interesting. And we'll have clips or links for all of the articles discussed tonight on Revolutionary Socialist Review under this video. So you can go down and click on them and take a look for yourself. So with that, I want to say thanks again, Rainer. Always a pleasure being here with you. And I want to bid our audience a sweet adieu until next week.